I had planned that family dinner with the intention of it being a moment to revive something that, somehow, seemed dormant between us. I wanted to return to lightness and intimacy, surrounded by our closest relatives and friends, creating memories that we would remember together. But deep down, I knew she was different. At first, I thought it was just the wear and tear of time, the tiredness of everyday life. And I kept pushing myself, ignoring the signs that I now realize were always there, screaming for attention. She grew cold, though her every word had the sweet poison of cordiality. She hugged me, yes, but I felt that her hug no longer had the warmth it used to have. Her touches, her smiles, everything felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. But still, I held on to the illusion that we were okay, because I wanted to believe that we were invincible. Then that dinner turned into something very different. I felt a strange chill in my chest when I saw her expression, harder, when we sat down at the table. She looked like she wanted to throw something into the air, and her every laugh was a distant echo of who she once was. Throughout dinner, I noticed her exchanging calculated glances with some guests, as if she was eager to share a secret that only she knew. She looked too different, more radiant than usual, but with an almost cruel glow. I tried to smile, keep the mood light, but I felt like she was on the verge of exploding something that could destroy me. And that's when it happened. Her smile, cold and calculated, gave way to words that, if they hadn't been spoken by her, I wouldn't believe. You know, he's not exactly who he thinks he is. She threw that sentence into the air, casually, and, in an instant, I felt everyone's eyes turning to me. Tension took over the environment, the sound of muffled laughter, and even the clinking of glasses, everything died down. She was looking at me, with a challenging look, as if she was waiting for me to react, as if she took pleasure in publicly disarming me. And suddenly, the pieces fell into place. The coldness, the empty smiles, the growing distance, she had been waiting for this moment, planning every detail to maximize the impact. I was not the husband I believed I was for her. She had kept me close enough that I didn't notice the theater, but distant enough that I never touched on the real reason for that cruel smile. And then, she continued with an air of superiority that I had never seen before. After all, sometimes people need to reinvent themselves. The blood boiled in my veins. She wanted to humiliate me, that was clear. But more than that, I wanted everyone there to witness what a foolish man she believed me to be. And I, with my heart in pieces, understood the purpose of that dinner. She wanted that moment, needed it, as if the betrayal wasn't enough. She wanted to see the damage, she wanted to see the shock on the faces of our family, our friends, as if this were the climax of a cruelly engineered play. The theater was set up, and I was the naive protagonist who had just realized the perverse script written by her. I tried to remain calm, to feel the weight of the betrayal without letting myself sink, but her every word cut me deeply. "You don't understand, do you?" she murmured, with an impassive smile, as I tried desperately to find some sign of remorse. She continued, each sentence sharp as a blade, "It's not that I want to break you up. I just want you to see what I've always seen." Pain took over me, not just for the infidelity, but for the cruelty with which she had waited for this moment. Then, as she rejoiced in the show, I realized I had one last card to play. That document, folded in my pocket, was already a reflection of my instinct for self-preservation, a last bit of dignity that I had saved for the right moment. I stood up, feeling the tension weigh down on every step I took towards her, and took out the letter. Absolute silence. Her expression changed, perhaps for the first time that night, when she saw the title on the envelope I handed over with a calculated gesture. She hesitated, her fingers shaking slightly as she opened the document. And there, in front of everyone, was what she hadn't expected, a divorce letter, the last answer I could give her. His eyes looked at me with a mixture of anger and surprise, but I felt no satisfaction. There was no revenge that could erase what she had done. Only emptiness remained. The choked words, the silence around us, every look that observed us, everything was part of a game that she had started, but that now seemed to be getting out of control. She seemed to hesitate, with the document in hand, as the reality became clear to everyone around her. The dinner, which had started as a family gathering, had turned into a public confrontation, an arena where the truth finally revealed itself. And as my decision hung between us, I saw something change in her eyes, maybe fear, maybe regret, but it was too late. Welcome to the channel. Here, we believe that betrayal is a wound that leaves deep marks, and we never support any form of disloyalty. Our stories are fictional, but they have a clear purpose: to show how betrayal destroys lives, families, and dreams. Get ready for an intense narrative, where love, jealousy, and regret intertwine in a breathtaking way. Now, sit back and be ready to hear a story that will move you. The dining room in Richard and Melissa's home glowed with discreet lighting from pendant lights, casting delicate shadows across the oak table. Richard, a tall man with a firm posture, maintained a calm expression as he carefully adjusted the cutlery, checking the details of a dinner that he hoped would be memorable. On his face, a serene, almost solemn expression reflected the desire to strengthen the connection with his wife, to rescue something essential between them that, without him realizing exactly when, seemed to have been lost. Melissa, on the other hand, moved around the house with a tranquility that almost bordered on indifference. With well-kept brown hair, fair skin, and an always enigmatic gaze, she exuded a magnetic confidence that impressed everyone around her. She knew how to be charming, she knew how to captivate an entire room with just a few words, and Richard loved that about her. But in recent months, he realized that, behind the smile she always wore at events and family gatherings, there was something he couldn't decipher. There was an emptiness, an absence of passion in the looks they exchanged, and it tormented him, even if he refused to admit it. Since the beginning of their relationship, Richard has always been the dedicated type of man. He worked tirelessly on his law career, maintaining the financial stability and comfort that he believed were the foundation for Melissa's and his own happiness. He liked to think he was a faithful, honest husband, someone Melissa could trust blindly. He had built his marriage on solid foundations, believing that over time, their love would only grow stronger. And for many years, that seemed true. Melissa, in turn, has always been an attentive wife, careful with the smallest details and charming in her displays of affection. At least, that's what he had always thought. In the first years of marriage, the two shared dreams and desires that Richard kept fondly in his memory. Together, they planned trips, set goals, shared moments of pure joy. But, as the years passed, the conversations that once flowed lightly became protocolary, almost impersonal. Richard, trying to understand what was happening, came to believe that everyday responsibilities were to blame. Between work and his family routine, he imagined that the natural tiredness of living together was responsible for that subtle distance. Melissa, however, seemed to see life from a different perspective. She valued the stability Richard provided her, and it showed. But, at the same time, his increasingly distant gaze, his frequent departures and his automatic responses left a trail of uneasiness in Richard's heart. She stated that they were meetings with friends, business dinners, afternoons at the beauty salon, excuses that Richard accepted without question. After all, he believed himself to be the type of husband who trusted his wife blindly. While Melissa cultivated an impeccable image as an elegant, well-rounded wife, Richard continued to believe that he and his wife shared the same silent commitment to building a future together. He was, in fact, a man of strict character, faithful to his promises, and believed that their marriage, although devoid of the fiery passion of the early years, was still based on respect and affection. Richard admired Melissa for her intelligence and the confident way she dealt with the world, and he often found himself reflecting on how lucky he was to have her by his side. He liked to think that, despite everything, they were still life companions. And then there was that dinner. An event planned weeks in advance, where Richard saw an opportunity for reconnection. Melissa accepted the proposal, although her excitement seemed more subdued than expected. She said she was excited, but her voice sounded distant, as if she were fulfilling a formality. However, Richard chose to ignore the feeling, trying to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that they were just small obstacles that any marriage faced. The afternoon before dinner, Richard found her in her room, wrapped in a dress that seemed custom-made for her. Melissa's natural elegance reminded him of the first days they started going out, of the sense of admiration he always felt when he saw her dressed for a special occasion. She looked impeccable, and he praised her, trying to break the invisible barrier that, he realized, existed between them. Melissa smiled in response, but Richard noticed there was something missing from that smile, a nuance he couldn't decipher. When the guests began to arrive, the house was filled with voices, laughter, and lively toasts. Friends and family sat around the table decorated with care by Richard. He wanted everything to be perfect. Over the years, he had learned that details mattered to Melissa, and even if it required him to organize an entire evening, he would strive to accommodate each of those tastes. He wanted her to notice his effort, to understand how much he still dedicated himself to her. Melissa, on the other hand, looked comfortable, almost exaggeratedly at ease. She moved around the room like a perfect hostess, her smile shining at every person present, but, interestingly, it was a smile that Richard barely saw when she looked at him. It was as if there was an invisible divide between them, as if he were just one of the guests. Conversation between them was minimal, reduced to greetings and whispers, while she busied herself with entertaining the others. At one point, while everyone was distracted in parallel conversations, Richard walked away for a moment, observing her from a distance. He was trying to understand how that relationship, which had previously seemed so solid, had turned into something so cold. Richard reflected on the memories they had made, on the moments when Melissa and he seemed to be perfectly aligned, and he felt a bitter nostalgia. He still had a deep affection for her, a love that made him want to fight for what they had built, but at that moment, he began to question whether he was alone in this fight. Melissa's gaze never escaped Richard's. He realized that although she was affable and endearing to others, something about her had changed. There was an air of mystery, a detachment that went beyond mere indifference. She spoke and smiled with a naturalness that was impressive, but when she looked at Richard, her eyes seemed a little colder, almost calculating. It was as if she was hiding something, a secret that only she knew. And as the night progressed, with the glasses being emptied and the atmosphere filled with increasingly relaxed conversations, Richard noticed that Melissa avoided being alone with him. Whenever he approached, she subtly moved away, addressing other guests, as if wanting to maintain a safe distance. The uneasiness Richard felt was taking shape, a feeling he couldn't explain. He watched her every gesture, every smile directed at someone else, and he felt like a stranger in his own home, in the life he thought was theirs. Melissa, on the other hand, seemed to be in control, sure of herself, showing no signs of hesitation. She acted with a calmness that made Richard doubt his own suspicions, but at the same time left him confused and vulnerable. He tried to convince himself that it was all just an unfounded fear, but a part of him insisted on seeking answers, on wanting to know what had changed. He felt torn between the desire to confront her and the fear of discovering that this new version of Melissa was, in fact, a reality that he refused to see. The night progressed and, for Richard, dinner was no longer a moment of celebration. He wanted this to be a reunion between them, a starting point for a new phase in their relationship, but instead, he felt that something was on the verge of being revealed. Melissa's serenity contrasted with the tension he felt in his chest. It was as if everything he believed about his marriage was about to fall apart. When dessert was served and the final toasts were made, Richard finally realized that no matter how hard he tried, he could no longer ignore what he was feeling. He knew that, somehow, this dinner was not what he had planned. Something was wrong, and he felt like control of his own life was slipping through his fingers. The atmosphere in the house seemed, to Richard, increasingly suffocating. The dinner he had so carefully planned now seemed like a silent trap closing around him. Each laugh echoed like a dissonant note, and Melissa's gaze seemed unfocused, as if her mind was somewhere else. She maintained an expression that oscillated between satisfaction and a strange absence. Richard, while observing everything around him, tried to capture every detail, every gesture of hers that could reveal what bothered him so much. The restlessness became unbearable. Throughout the evening, as the guests chatted animatedly, Richard tried to get closer to Melissa, but she seemed determined to avoid him. She moved among the guests, smiling and sharing stories, but every time he tried to start a conversation, she would look away or say she was busy. Richard felt like a stranger in his own home, in the presence of the woman he loved, but who now seemed to be slipping away from him in a subtle but painful way. After dinner, when the guests began to disperse into small groups, Richard tried one last time to get closer. He found her in the kitchen, calmly washing a glass of wine, concentrating on each movement as if she were in a rehearsed choreography. The silent environment and yellowish lights created a feeling of isolation. Richard, not knowing exactly what he wanted to ask, just murmured, "Are you well?" Melissa looked at him for a moment, and he noticed a shadow cross her face, something that was quickly replaced by a controlled smile. "I'm great, why wouldn't I be?" she replied, her voice firmer than he expected. But Richard knew something was wrong. The coldness in her eyes, the calculated distance, everything indicated that she was hiding something. He couldn't define exactly what it was, but instinct was alerting him to a truth that perhaps he wasn't prepared to face. With the guests finally leaving, the house returned to silence. Richard and Melissa found themselves alone in the room, the tension between them so thick it seemed to fill the space. Melissa, seeming oblivious to the anguish that gripped Richard, sat on the sofa, crossing her legs with a naturalness that, to him, seemed irritatingly rehearsed. Richard approached, and before he could control the intensity of his voice, he said, "I need to understand what is happening between us. I feel like we're growing apart, and you seem so far away." Melissa smiled, but the smile was a mask. There was a defiant gleam in her eyes, as if she were about to reveal something, but only to provoke a reaction from Richard. "Maybe it's you who can't see," she replied, her voice soft, almost indifferent. This answer, vague and ambiguous, made Richard's blood run cold. He felt helpless, unable to understand what was going on inside the mind of the woman with whom he shared his life. She was looking at him now with an expression that wavered between impatience and disinterest, and he realized that this moment was about to reveal something devastating. The tension between them increased with the silence, and Richard felt his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted answers, he needed her to say something that would give him a clue as to what was tormenting him so much. Finally, unable to bear the pressure, he sat down next to her, his eyes fixed on Melissa's face, trying to capture any trace of sincerity. "I can't take this anymore, Melissa. Are you hiding something from me?" he asked, in a more urgent tone, his voice broken by tiredness and frustration. Melissa sighed, and for a moment, it looked like she considered saying something. But instead, she got up, walked to the window and looked out, as if searching for an invisible exit in the darkness. "Some things just change, Richard. Maybe what we have isn't enough anymore," she said, without looking at him. Her words hit Richard like a dull blow. The insinuation was clear, but he still didn't want to believe that it could be true. He stood up, trying to remain calm, and walked over to her, placing his hand on her shoulder, trying to get one last approach. Melissa, however, moved away, taking a step back, and it was then that he noticed the absolute coldness in her eyes. It was as if the woman he had known was absent, leaving only an indifferent shadow in her place. "Melissa, we have always been honest with each other. Why can't we solve this together?" he insisted, with a ray of hope. She looked at him with a tired expression, and finally replied, "Sincerity. I don't think you really want this, Richard. Sometimes the truth only brings more pain." Richard's pain and confusion were replaced by a growing restlessness. He felt like he was being pushed into an abyss, a place where everything he knew and loved could be destroyed. And then, in a burst of courage, he looked deep into her eyes and murmured, "I want to know the truth, Melissa. Whatever." Melissa held his gaze, and for a brief second, he saw something falter in her expression, as if an invisible wall was breaking. And it was in that moment, in that brief moment of hesitation, that Richard knew. He didn't need her to say anything, everything was there, in her gaze, in the way she looked away, unable to sustain the confrontation. The truth was finally revealed, cruel and unforgiving. It was another man, Melissa murmured, the words falling into the silence like stones. She looked away, unable to look at him, and a wave of silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of revelation. Richard froze, unable to process what he had just heard. Betrayal, which he had never imagined possible, was now before him, raw and devastating. The silence that followed Melissa's revelation was piercing, but Richard seemed frozen, unable to react to the impact it had caused him. He walked away, eyes fixed on the ground, breathing heavily as he tried to piece together a reality he was unaware of until just a few minutes ago. The woman with whom he had shared his life, his dreams, his home, was now here, exposing a betrayal that seemed to destroy every foundation he believed to be solid. But the pain of that revelation wasn't everything. Something about her attitude, the controlled way in which she admitted the affair, indicated that there was more. Melissa watched Richard with a look that mixed resignation and disturbing calm, as if that confession was just one part of a larger story. He raised his face, still astonished, and noticed that she was looking at him with an almost condescending expression, as if the act of confessing was a favor, a concession to him. That posture made him explode. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice breaking, his face filled with an expression of disbelief. After everything we built together, is that what you have to say?" She sighed, a sigh that seemed to carry years of secrets and lies, and responded with a calm that hit him like an even crueler blow. "I don't know what you expected, Richard. There is nothing more to be said." His words were cold, cutting, and Richard felt that the person he had known had been replaced by an almost unknown figure. He looked around, searching the empty room for some anchor, something to remind him that this was his life, that this was his wife. But in that moment, everything felt foreign, distant, as if their home had turned into a crime scene. Every detail of the decoration, every object that he had once chosen with care, everything now hurt him, everything seemed like a farce. Richard felt a growing anger, but with it, a desperate need to understand how this had happened. He approached her, his voice now low, filled with frustration and sadness. "How did you manage to live through all of this?" he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. While I believed in us." Melissa looked at him, this time with a slightly altered expression, as if something inside her was also about to collapse. And then, before he could react, she spoke, in an almost merciless way, "Maybe it's time you found out what's really going on. And, to be honest, I'm tired of hiding it." She walked over to the coffee table and pulled out an envelope that Richard hadn't noticed. A simple white envelope, but one that seemed to contain a much deeper and more painful truth than he imagined. She handed him the envelope, without hesitation, and watched him as he opened it, his hands shaking, his heart racing. Inside were papers, documents that took him a few seconds to understand. There were loan contracts, bank statements, debt reports, all in your name. Richard felt dizzy when he realized that exorbitant sums of money were compromised, and everything was linked to a series of financial operations that he had never authorized. He looked at Melissa, his face brimming with confusion and despair. "Melissa, what is this?" He barely managed to form the question, his voice barely audible. She remained impassive, her expression cold as a mask. When he spoke, his voice had a calculated, almost dismissive tone. "These are your debts, Richard. Or rather, our debts, but which, for all intents and purposes, are in your name." He blinked several times, trying to absorb the information. Disbelief turned into a sense of betrayal so deep he could barely breathe. She, his wife, had done this, made catastrophic financial decisions in his name, without him knowing anything. Did you use my name for all of this?" He could hardly believe he was saying those words. "Why? How could you do this to me?" Melissa finally showed emotion, a slight smile that looked almost like satisfaction. "Because I had to, Richard. And you never questioned anything. You were always so confident, so sure that you controlled everything. I only did what was necessary to keep up appearances. Her statement was like a sentence. He watched her, trying to find some remnant of the woman he had loved, but all he saw was someone who had planned his every move, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate him, how to leverage his trust. Richard felt his legs weaken, and he sat down, still holding the papers. His mind tried to process the impact of the revelations that surrounded him, but it was as if everything were a nightmare. He looked at Melissa one last time, and the pain turned into something deeper, a devastating sadness, a sense of irreparable loss. I was never enough for you, was I? He murmured, more to himself than to her. She then delivered the final blow, without hesitation. It's not a question of being enough or not, Richard. It's a question of survival, of convenience. And you were always convenient. Richard remained seated, still holding the papers in his hands, as if they were weights that kept him anchored in a new and devastating reality. Melissa's revelation, every word calculated and cruel, still echoed in his mind, breaking the barriers of everything he believed he knew. The woman he considered faithful and his life partner was there, as distant as she was unrecognizable, as if he were seeing her now for the first time. The room, which had been the scene of so many celebrations, now seemed a cold and hostile place. The furniture, carefully chosen over the years, became mute witnesses to an elaborate hoax that, unbeknownst to him, had shaped his entire life. Richard's moral dilemma intensified by the moment. He oscillated between confronting her with the same coldness she displayed or retreating, accepting what she had done as a reality that he was unable to change. Yet every fiber of his being cried out for justice, for answers that made sense for the man he was, someone who believed in the value of integrity. Melissa remained impassive, watching him with a gaze that was both indifferent and analytical. She seemed to know exactly what he was feeling, but she showed no empathy, no sign of regret. His expression conveyed a cutting coldness, as if the consequences of his actions were mere details in the face of his own interests. Richard's voice finally broke the silence, although the intensity of his anger was contained in a low, almost whispered tone. You destroyed everything, Melissa. Not just our relationship, but our life, everything we've built. How can you look at me now and act like none of this matters? She sighed, looking slightly irritated by his insistence on seeking an explanation. His answer came like a sharp razor, because, Richard, I don't see the world the way you do. While you were too busy believing in fairy tales, I learned to see things as they really are. What I did was what anyone would do to ensure their own comfort. And I have no regrets. Richard stood up, feeling the weight of her words on his shoulders. The pain of realizing that the woman he had loved had not only betrayed him, but disregarded him to the point of reducing everything to a matter of convenience, was suffocating. He wondered how real that relationship had been, or if, from the beginning, he had been manipulated. Little by little, the anguish that dominated him gave way to deep sadness. He realized that, despite everything, he still loved the idea of what he and Melissa had built together, the life he once thought they shared. But now, he saw clearly how fragile that life was, based on illusions she had shaped to maintain a facade. The moral dilemma he faced consumed him inside. On one hand, he felt the impulse to confront her, to seek justice that would expose every lie, every manipulation. In the other, he knew that Melissa was unshakable, cold and strategic, and that confronting her could be as fruitless as trying to melt ice with words. He wondered if something was still worth fighting for, or if it was time to abandon that battle, accept the losses and rebuild his life away from her. But the hurt pride, the feeling of injustice and the pain of betrayal seemed to grow with each second. He looked into her eyes one last time, searching for some trace of humanity, some fraction of regret, any sign that, at some point, she had been sincere. But all he found was the same indifference. You don't really care, do you? He murmured, almost like a lament. She shrugged, as if the question were irrelevant. I care about what's necessary for me, Richard. And what was necessary, I already did. The phrase echoed in his mind, and he realized he had never really met her. Every moment, every smile she had given him over the years, everything now seemed like a meticulous construction, a mask that hid the real woman who now seemed merciless and oblivious to his feelings. Finally, Richard took a deep breath, searching for one last shred of dignity. He knew that even though he was devastated, he couldn't let Melissa have control over what was left of him. With a determined look, he walked away, turning his back and leaving her alone in that room that, in a few minutes, had transformed from home to a scene of desolation. As he walked outside, he felt the weight of the choice he needed to make. She could seek justice, confront every debt Melissa had accumulated in her name, expose every detail of what she had done. But at the same time, he knew that this path would be arduous, full of confrontations and possibly too painful for what he now sought, peace. Richard wanted, more than anything, to escape the game Melissa had set up and find a way to live without the shadow of her betrayal. Once in his room, he closed the door, trying to process the complexity of what lay ahead. He was ruined financially and emotionally, and every future plan he had built for himself seemed to dissolve before his eyes. But at the same time, he realized that he had a chance to free himself from Melissa, to start over, even if it was under the rubble of what his life had once been. And, paradoxically, this realization brought a sense of relief. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, letting the tears flow freely, releasing the pain he had kept contained throughout the confrontation. The anger, the disgust, the humiliation, everything was mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions that he couldn't control. He didn't know how long he spent there, lost in his own pain, but when he finally stood up, something inside him had changed. That wasn't the end of it. He knew he would have to face the consequences of debts, betrayals and every choice she made in his name. But I also knew that, somehow, he would survive. The clock struck late at night when he left the room, the house silent as the tomb. Melissa remained in the room, as if waiting for one last reaction, one last movement from him, but Richard walked past her in silence. He wouldn't allow her to see him shaken, not anymore. Richard, after hours of solitary reflection, decided that he would not fight on the same terms as Melissa. He would leave her with the consequences of her own actions, but that didn't mean she would come out unscathed. The first step was to look for a specialized lawyer to reverse everything that could be undone. He wanted every step to be meticulously calculated, not in pursuit of pure revenge, but to ensure that her every decision weighed on his own shoulders. To that end, he gathered documents, spoke to experts and replanned his next moves. Melissa's betrayal had left deep scars, but Richard was determined to emerge from that chaos stronger than before. Meanwhile, Melissa began to feel the effects of her own trap. Before long, her actions, which had previously given her a false sense of control, began to turn against her. The debts she had placed in Richard's name were being questioned by lawyers and banks. The attempt to drain her husband's resources for herself now encountered legal barriers, as Richard had obtained injunctions that froze all financial transactions going through his name. Melissa, confident that he would never have the courage to act against her, now found herself surrounded, without the funds she had so planned to use for herself. To make matters worse, Melissa's image among friends and family collapsed. Once admired as an elegant and sophisticated woman, she began to be viewed with suspicion and contempt. Those who once applauded her charm began to notice the coldness and calculation she had always hidden. The void she thought she could fill with money and status became increasingly evident, and loneliness a new constant companion. Melissa, for the first time, felt vulnerable and without the control she valued so much. Richard, on the other hand, found unexpected peace amidst the chaos. He began to rebuild his life little by little, rediscovering the pleasure of simple moments, without the oppressive presence of someone who manipulated him. The pain of betrayal still throbbed in his chest, but he used it as fuel to move forward, deciding to be honest with himself and the future that was now in his own hands. Melissa's liberation process allowed him to rebuild himself, rediscovering the value of loyalty and respect, which he knew he deserved. Months later, at a final hearing, Richard and Melissa met for the last time. Melissa, who once exuded an almost impenetrable confidence, now looked tired, worn down by her own choices. He watched her with a serene gaze, feeling that, finally, the cycle was about to close. The judge, at the end of the hearing, gave the verdict that ended all of Melissa's attempts to extract more than her fair share. Richard, now free from financial and emotional constraints, left the courtroom feeling lighter than ever. When he left, he didn't look back. It left Melissa with the weight of debts, losses, and the consequences of her actions. For him, that was the last page of a chapter marked by illusions and lies. That same afternoon, Richard began a new cycle, aware that starting over would be a challenge, but now he could do it in peace. And so, the story comes to an end. Leave in the comments what you thought of Richard and Melissa's journey. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show the consequences of disloyalty and betrayal. We remind you that our channel does not support any type of betrayal, but rather seeks to show how these acts destroy lives and relationships.